My name is Hannah, and I am 35 years old. I recently divorced my husband, Matthew, who is the same age as I am. Together, we have a 9-year-old daughter named Chloe. For 7 years, I was married to Matthew, but one misstep. An affair with my colleague, Logan, who works at the same small accounting firm as I do, caused everything to collapse. What I initially thought was an exciting flirtation turned into something that pulled me away from my family and revealed sides of Logan I could never have imagined. My marriage to Matthew ended abruptly, and I was forced to face the consequences of the choices I had made. This is the story I want to share here. I wish I could say there was a clear starting point to the infidelity, an exact date when I decided to cross that forbidden line. But in reality, it crept up on me. The feeling of restlessness grew within me over a long period. For the longest time, I thought it was just a phase, a kind of boredom that would pass. It was easy to dismiss the burning longing for something different as a temporary curiosity, especially when I compared my quiet life to Matthew's calm demeanor. Matthew is, and always has been, gentle, thoughtful, and sometimes almost too calm. At one time, I was incredibly grateful for this quality because it gave me a sense of security. But over time, I began to interpret his calmness as a lack of passion and excitement. Once those thoughts took root, it became hard to resist temptation. The first compliment wasn't anything spectacular. Logan simply said I looked fresh that morning. But he looked me straight in the eye and smiled, and it felt as though he gave me a glimpse of something I had been missing: excitement, attention, validation. It was as if I realized at that moment that something new was about to begin. After that, it became a spiral of small sparks: messages with overly friendly emojis, comments about my clothes, invitations to have coffee one-on-one. I convinced myself it was innocent, that while I enjoyed Logan's company, it didn't have to mean anything more than that. I was married. I had a stable life. I was a good mother. But when those quick coffee meetings turned into long conversations at work, and the long conversations became late evenings at the office, it became clear to me that I didn't want to break the connection. I could have pulled back. I should have pulled back. Yet I didn't. I felt drawn to Logan. His way of talking about his dreams, his flirtations, the way he made me feel alive. It awakened something in me that had been dormant. It wasn't just the thrill of doing something forbidden, but also the delight of being clearly desired by someone. That blinded me to everything else, including the damage I was risking. It took a while before the actual physical betrayal happened. I was nervous and a bit scared at the thought of going all the way. What would it mean for my marriage? What would it mean for my role as a mother? But on the other hand, I felt something inside me crying out to be seen, validated, and excited. I convinced myself it would only be a one-time thing, that I could stop whenever I wanted. The same lies I believe many people tell themselves in similar situations. And so the affair began. At first, we were sneaky. We had secret dinners, met during lunch breaks, kissed in the office supply room after everyone else had left. The initial period was dizzyingly intense. I couldn't think clearly, constantly planning new moments for us. Lying to Matthew felt surprisingly easy at first. I said I needed to work overtime or meet a friend. He was always accommodating, worried that I might be taking on too much, yet supportive of my career development. Looking back, I feel deep shame over how I exploited his trust. After several months of lies and secret meetings, the affair culminated in the most shocking situation. Matthew came home earlier than expected one day, and Logan was there. We were in the living room, Logan and I, in an intimate situation. We had thrown ourselves onto the sofa, completely oblivious to the consequences. Suddenly, I heard the sound of the front door opening. I panicked, jumped up, and tried to get Logan to understand that he needed to hide. But it was already too late. Matthew walked in. I saw in his eyes how he drew the conclusions in a fraction of a second. Logan leapt to his feet, fumbling to get his shirt on properly, and tried to find the exit. I will never forget how Matthew stood there, completely silent and utterly calm. No anger in his voice, no shouting. just that cold look that spoke of how the betrayal had landed squarely in his heart. Logan rushed out through the back door while I stood there, not knowing what to say or do. Afterward, there was no outburst of rage. Matthew just looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, but he didn't cry aloud. It was as if something inside me broke when I saw his face. I tried to start explaining, but he interrupted me. He coldly stated that he didn't need to know anything else. It was over. Then he asked me to pack my things and leave. The shock washed over me like a wave. There I stood, thinking I had a love affair and a sparkling new beginning. But in reality, it felt like I was falling into a void as I stumbled out of the house with a hastily gathered bag of clothes and a toothbrush. Chloe, thankfully, wasn't home at the time. She was at a friend's house. And for that, I might be grateful. She didn't have to witness that terrible moment. I called Logan, and he invited me to stay with him. I had nowhere else to go and no concept of what I was supposed to do. I was in a trance-like state. There was a shameful sense of relief in me simply because the secrets were out in the open, and I figured Logan and I could now be together without sneaking around. But pretty soon, I noticed that much of the initial passion disappeared once we no longer had to hide. What had first attracted me, the danger, the excitement, the forbiddenness, was suddenly allowed and public. That made me see Logan in a different light. Already in the first week after I moved in with Logan, I was called by several mutual friends of Matthew and me. They were furious or sad, questioning how I could do something like this. Some of them immediately cut ties. Others tried to remain neutral, but it was clear they were on Matthew's side. I don't blame them. Matthew is a good person, and what I did hurt him deeply. My entire social network began unraveling around me. I tried to keep my head high, but deep inside, I felt a growing unease. I started questioning what on earth I was doing. Yet I continued living with Logan, thinking there was no way back. About a month after I left my home, I had my first proper conversation with Chloe. She was deeply sad but seemed mostly confused. She was living with Matthew, but he assured me that I could see her whenever I wanted. At that point, we didn't have any formal custody arrangement. He was as calm as ever, making sure Chloe didn't have to suffer unnecessarily. I could pick her up whenever I wanted. But every time I saw her, it felt like she looked at me with a gaze that was painful to meet. I understood that I was the reason her mom and dad no longer lived together. I was the reason nothing was the same anymore. When I told Logan I was planning to have Chloe over to his apartment from time to time, he initially seemed understanding. But I noticed in his body language that he wasn't entirely on board with the idea. He forced a smile and nodded stiffly. A small alarm bell should have gone off, but I was too caught up in the chaos. Instead, I tried to plan fun things to do with Chloe when she visited, but in the back of my mind, a worry nagged at me. How would Chloe react to staying overnight in Logan's apartment for the first time? It couldn't be easy to see her mom living with a new man so soon after the divorce. But Chloe, being a child who missed her mom, came to visit a few weekends in a row. The first time we sat down for dinner together, Logan talked way too much about how foolish it was to marry young and insinuated that Matthew and I had been a mismatched couple. I felt Chloe go quiet and glance at me. It felt like an icy wind swept through the room. I asked Logan to change the subject and tried to lighten the mood with a joke. He fell into a strained silence, glaring at me from under his brow. Later, he told me I shouldn't tell him what he could and couldn't talk about in his own home. The unease in his voice made me look away. I mumbled an apology. Chloe went to sit in front of the TV, and I tried to smooth things over. But I noticed Logan wouldn't let go of the topic. After Chloe went to bed, he looked at me and said, "I just want her to understand that you're better off here. I want her to see me as something good in your life." I didn't fully understand why he was so eager to be accepted. It scared me a little. Over time, my relationship with Chloe became more and more strained. She didn't seem to outright dislike Logan, but she was stiff and cautious around him. She often talked about how much she missed her dad. I tried to stay diplomatic, encouraging her to talk to Matthew as often as she wanted. But Logan didn't like that we kept in frequent phone contact. He said it was disrupting my healing process. and that I needed to distance myself from my old life. I thought his attitude was strange, but I naively believed he had my best interests at heart. Perhaps he was afraid I'd regret my decision and go back to Matthew. One day, when I was about to leave for work, Logan suddenly asked where I was going and who I planned to have lunch with. His tone carried a hint of suspicion. I smiled tiredly and said I didn't have any specific lunch plans. He just nodded but held his gaze on me for a little too long. Later that day, while I was at the office, he called me several times to check what I was doing. I tried to laugh it off, but inside the warning signs began to ring loudly. Despite this, I still found it difficult to set clear boundaries. I didn't have my own place to live. I couldn't afford to arrange something on my own at that point, as the divorce and financial division were still ongoing. I was too proud to ask Matthew for support. And I had lost several close friends. Logan was simply my only anchor in an otherwise chaotic situation. A few months after I had moved in with Logan, his controlling behavior became increasingly apparent in ways that frightened me. He wanted to know exactly when I was done with work, questioned whether I really needed to meet certain colleagues for work-related reasons, and didn't like it when I even spoke to other men at the office. I gritted my teeth, often making excuses to go home directly after work to avoid conflicts. At the same time, I couldn't help but wonder, why hadn't I seen this side of him before? I thought I knew Logan. I guess it was a combination of my blind infatuation, my self-imposed blinders, and the fact that Logan was good at maintaining a charming facade as long as things went his way. At one point, an old friend I hadn't spoken to in a long time called to check on me. We talked for about half an hour. When I hung up, I saw Logan standing in the kitchen doorway. He asked who I had been talking to. When I said it was an old friend, he started questioning me. Why is she calling now? Does she want to stir up trouble about me? His face was tense, his voice sharp. I tried to reassure him, saying we had just talked about general things and that she was worried about me. Then he stared at me and said, "Does she think I'm crazy or something?" I stammered that, of course, she didn't think anything of the sort, that she simply missed me. He rolled his eyes and walked away. My whole body trembled. More and more, my stomach twisted with anxiety, and I began wondering how in the world I could get out of this situation. But my pride and my shame kept me from asking Matthew for help. I also didn't feel like I had any friends I could trust, especially not after so many had already turned their backs on me. During this period, Chloe became my only bright spot, the only person I loved unconditionally and who loved me back. I tried to see her as often as I could. Most of the time, I visited Matthew's new apartment, or he brought Chloe to a nearby place where we could meet. But I noticed Logan becoming increasingly frustrated every time I was gone. He called me repeatedly, asking when I would be home, claiming he couldn't sleep until I returned. It all came to a head when Chloe was going to stay over at Logan's for a longer visit for the first time. She arrived with a small suitcase, looking tired. I tried to cheer her up, suggesting we cook her favorite meal together. But from the start, the atmosphere felt strange. Logan was restless, pacing back and forth. He wanted to know exactly what Matthew had said before Chloe left. Chloe, who is a very straightforward and honest child, told him the truth. Dad said I should call him if you seem scary. Chloe probably didn't mean to hurt Logan. She was just recounting things verbatim. But I saw Logan's jaw tighten. He didn't say anything, but he went to the living room and sat down while I tried to distract Chloe with a movie and some snacks. The explosion came later that evening during the bedtime routine. Chloe and I were in the bathroom brushing teeth and putting on pajamas when Logan suddenly banged on the door, demanding to know where his phone was. I had no idea what he was talking about. I hadn't touched it. I opened the door and told him so. He stared at me, accusing me of snooping on his phone. I took a step back, feeling my heart race. His voice was loud and Chloe ran over, standing between us. I tried to calm him down, saying, "Logan, I haven't touched your phone. Why would I do that?" He then claimed I was trying to sabotage his connections with certain people. It was so irrational that I didn't even know how to respond. Chloe started crying and begged him to calm down. And then, in a moment of pure rage, he slapped me across the face. It wasn't a punch, but it was hard enough to sting. I lost my balance and stumbled into the doorframe, hitting my shoulder. Chloe screamed. Logan turned toward her. I saw him raise his hand. He hesitated for a moment, then his open palm struck her cheek. Everything happened so fast, yet it felt like slow motion. I heard my own voice scream loudly. Chloe fell back, hitting the edge of the bathtub. Tears streamed down her face and panic overwhelmed me. My maternal instincts kicked in. I rushed toward Logan, shoving him hard in the chest. I screamed at him to never touch my child again. He staggered backward, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't seem to understand what he had just done. Or maybe he did, but I wasn't sure. I grabbed Chloe, pulling her close to me, and ran toward the front door. Logan shouted my name. I yelled back that he could forget ever seeing me again. We ran down the stairs of the building and out onto the street. I didn't even have my shoes on, but I was so terrified that I didn't care. All I wanted was to protect Chloe and get as far away from that man as possible. We flagged down a taxi with shaking hands. Chloe was crying. I was crying. After a few minutes, a cab arrived and we jumped in. I told the driver to take us far away. That night, we checked into a cheap hotel. I didn't call Matthew immediately because I didn't know what to say. I just held Chloe and tried to comfort her. She was completely distraught, clinging tightly to me. I felt her heartbeat and how she trembled. I cursed myself for exposing her to this. I was her mother. I was supposed to protect her. Instead, I had dragged her into something horrific. Eventually, we fell asleep. When morning came, I woke up feeling drained. The first thing I saw was Chloe's tear-streaked face. She tried to say something but struggled to find the words. Finally, she crawled close to me and whispered, "Mom, I'm scared." I promised her she would never have to see Logan again. I promised her everything would be okay. But I didn't have a concrete plan. How would I fix this? I didn't even have the money to stay at the hotel for long, and I had no apartment in my name. As I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to figure out what to do, Chloe went into the bathroom. I heard her talking to someone on the phone, and when she came out, she handed the phone to me. It was Matthew. She had called him secretly. His voice was strangely calm, but there was a stiffness in his tone. He wanted to know where we were. I told him the name of the hotel. He asked to speak with Chloe. They whispered a few words. Then she hung up and told me her dad had promised to take care of this. I felt a strange mix of relief and worry. What did he mean by take care of this? There was something in his tone that made me uneasy. I don't know exactly what went through Matthew's mind, but he must have been furious, in his quiet way, when he heard Logan had hit Chloe. She had a faint bruise on her cheek, clearly visible in the light of the hotel room, and it made me nauseous. Matthew had never raised his voice, let alone his hand, against either me or Chloe. For someone else to lay a hand on his daughter was unforgivable in his eyes. I understood he was determined to deal with Logan, but I didn't think he would actually confront him in person. Matthew was the kind of person who avoided confrontations. Yet that's exactly what happened. Later that day, one of my few remaining friends, Emma, called and told me that Matthew had gone to Logan's apartment. He had knocked on the door and demanded to speak to him. But Logan wasn't alone. Apparently, 3 of Logan's friends were there too, hanging out for some reason. None of them opened the door when Matthew knocked. They reportedly stood on the other side of the door, telling him to leave. That's when he kicked the door in and walked inside. It was so unlike the Matthew, I knew that I was utterly speechless. Emma said Matthew directly asked who had hit his daughter. At first, no one answered. Eventually, Logan admitted it was him. Matthew nodded, and then he tried to walk straight toward Logan. The 3 other men got in his way, trying to stop him. Here's something I need to explain. Matthew had mentioned in passing that he trained martial arts when he was younger, but I never thought it was serious. I had always seen him as a gentle person, maybe someone who had dabbled in karate in his teens. But according to Emma, who got the story from one of the men who had been there, Matthew was phenomenal at fighting. He took down the 3 men without much effort. They fell like dominoes, Emma said. Hearing this gave me chills. I couldn't reconcile this image of my calm, harmonious ex-husband with that of a skilled fighter, but that's exactly what they described. When the three men were either lying on the floor or sitting stunned, Matthew continued toward Logan. He reportedly delivered 3 quick, hard punches. No long speech, no drawn-out scolding, just raw, physical blows. Logan fell to the ground, and Matthew turned and walked out of the apartment. Emma told me none of the men called the police afterward. They were too proud, or maybe too afraid, to admit they'd been beaten by a man they assumed was harmless. Emma had heard the story secondhand, but was sure something serious had happened because one of Logan's friends later confessed it wasn't worth reporting. They don't want to admit they got thoroughly beaten, he had apparently said. And I don't understand why a man this skilled wouldn't want to tell everyone about it or show it off. It doesn't make sense to me. I didn't know what to feel when Emma told me everything. Shock, fear, or perhaps a twisted sense of relief. Not relief over the violence itself, but over the fact that Logan had been given a clear message. Nothing could excuse what Logan had done to me and Chloe, but I never thought Matthew would resort to such measures, that he even felt compelled to go there. I broke down in tears on the phone. Emma asked if I was okay, if I had somewhere to go. That same evening, Matthew called me. His voice was low, almost a whisper. He asked if Chloe was okay. I told him she had a faint bruise on her cheek, but was otherwise physically unharmed. There was silence on the other end of the line before he asked, "Do you want me to take you somewhere safe?" I was surprised and grateful for the offer, but I also felt a heavy sense of shame. How could I ask him for help after I had caused all this? After I had betrayed him and thrown away our life together? I told him I didn't deserve his help. He replied that this wasn't about me. It was about Chloe. He insisted that Chloe and I should come to his place, at least temporarily. I agreed, as I saw no other option. I remember that feeling of standing in the hotel room, holding my daughter's hand, knowing I had run out of choices. I couldn't afford the hotel anymore. I couldn't go back to Logan, who had just hit both me and Chloe. I had no friends to turn to. The only person still willing to open their door to me was my ex-husband, whose heart I had shattered. The fact that Matthew was willing to help us in that situation shows what a genuinely good person he is. So Chloe and I took a taxi to his place. Matthew was standing in the doorway when we arrived. He met my eyes, and I saw a shadow of something dark in his expression, as if he had been through an inner war. I tried to apologize, to say something, anything, but stopped when he shook his head and raised a hand. "We don't need to talk about it now," he said. "Let's just make sure Chloe feels safe and calm first." I took off Chloe's jacket. She threw herself into his arms and began crying again. He carried her into the living room and sat down with her in his lap. I stood in the hallway, feeling like a stranger. I didn't know if I should follow them or stay where I was. Later that evening, Matthew put Chloe to bed while I sat in the kitchen, staring blankly at the wall. I could hear her sniffles as he sang a little lullaby to her, the same one I used to sing to her when she was younger. It tore at my heart. I didn't want to disturb them, so I stayed put. When Matthew came into the kitchen, he sat down across from me. We didn't exchange pleasantries. Instead, he looked at the mark on my cheek where Logan's slap had left a faint bruise. His voice was tight when he asked if I was in pain. I told him it just felt a little sore. He sighed heavily and looked down at the table. Finally, he murmured, "What happened, Hannah?" I tried to explain that Logan had gotten angry, that I hadn't understood how violent he could become. There wasn't much else to say. He listened silently, nodding occasionally. I could feel his disgust, but I also sensed a kind of compassion that I didn't deserve. In the days that followed, I kept a low profile in Matthew's apartment. I tried to be a mother to Chloe, but I felt lost. I desperately wanted to repair my relationship with her, and with Matthew, but I knew there was no simple way to do so. The few times Matthew and I spoke at length, it was mostly about practical matters. School, work, what Chloe needed in terms of clothes. He avoided discussing us, our history, or my infidelity. I think he needed time, and even I didn't know what I wanted to say about it. I carried so much shame, regret, and sorrow. During this time, I was also faced with the decision of whether to report Logan to the police. I sought Matthew's advice, but he said it was my choice. Do what you think is right, he said, looking away. In the end, I decided to report him. After all, Chloe had been hit too. There were clear signs of abuse, including her bruise. I went to the police and told them everything. They asked a lot of questions. I was scared because I was convinced Logan would come after me for revenge. But the police took my report seriously, and I submitted it. Then I walked out of the station on shaking legs, feeling like I was slowly emerging from something horrific but uncertain about what lay ahead. Eventually, I managed to find an apartment. I couldn't stay at my old job, so I applied to another accounting firm. I had to take a significant pay cut. It turns out sleeping with the boss only earns you certain advantages temporarily. My new employer decided to pay me a fair but modest salary, not excessive. This meant I couldn't afford a fancy apartment, but it was enough. Under the circumstances, I was mostly grateful just to have a job. Now I'm sitting here in my small apartment, without a husband, without a lover, without a boyfriend. I don't trust my judgment when it comes to men anymore. It's better to be alone. Deep down, I hope that someday I might find my way back to Matthew. But that feels far-fetched. I'm still shocked by how my ex-husband managed to hide his skills all these years. Shouldn't a man this talented want to tell the world or show it off? It feels as if I never really knew him on a deeper level. What other extraordinary qualities might he be hiding that I still don't know about?
If you liked this story, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It helps a lot, and you won't miss out on any future stories. Take care and live your best life.